Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki announced her retirement from the top position, but it comes after calls for her resignation over allegations of political interference and mishandling of the RCMP's response to the convoy protest. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendocino says the government understands the challenges of the mandate of the RCMP Commissioner.
There is a robust set of priorities that are there when it comes to a wide range of priorities, but the key thing will be to make sure that we attract the very best and brightest person who is going to be able to meet the RCMP where they're at.
So what's to be made of the timing of Lucki's retirement? What kind of challenges will the Liberals face replacing her? Let's bring in everybody. Chantal Hebert, Althia Raj, and Andrew Coyne. Good to see you all. Althia, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk about the timing. I think there were questions after Brenda Lucki's testimony at the Emergencies Act inquiry. Do we see any coincidence here that the report will be released tomorrow and she is leaving? She's announced at least she's leaving this week.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to try to read between the lines, but there is a high likelihood that the report is not incredibly favorable to her. If you'll recall, during her testimony, she admitted that she did not speak up during a cabinet meeting of the Special Incident Response Group, where her opinion, her advice was that actually the RCMP had the tools it needed. It didn't need the Emergencies Act. And then Jody Thomas, who's the National Security Advisor for the Prime Minister, said, well, you know, you have a duty to speak up if you have something to say. You don't wait until you're called. So it's possible that, you know, there is a dark cloud hanging over her in that report, but also in the Nova Scotia inquiry reports. And that report is due at the end of March, where, if you'll recall, she was accused of basically holding the Liberals' agenda, trying to get the local RCMP to release the type of gun that was used to help with the Liberals' gun control legislation. And there were a lot of questions about what she had promised Bill Blair's office or the Prime Minister. You know, she admitted on tape that she was waiting for the Prime Minister to call her so she could offer her apologies. So there were a lot of questions. You know, the Conservative Party, for example, does not trust her. It was hard to see how she was going to stay in that position anyways. Like that the Liberals were going to renew her term. So I think she is probably trying to leave before having to answer some perhaps more murky questions.
So what, Chantal, does this tell us about the role of the RCMP, or was this a Brenda Lucki problem, or is this a bigger problem in your mind?
It does start with leadership, and everything that Althia has described means that her term was almost up in a few weeks. There had been absolutely no sense that the government was going to renew her appointment or extend it, although it was clear that she wanted to stay on. She told at least one newspaper interviewer that she wanted to stay on. I'm sure that one person cannot change an institution, but I also do not for a second believe that the cabinet and the minister in charge of the RCMP are competent to make changes to the RCMP that will work, and two, that they should, because that would be bringing politics into the police force, and that is the last thing you want. Now, watching the Minister Mendocino, I hope he's not trying to say that this is taking them by surprise, and so it will take months for someone to be appointed, because they have had the date in the calendar where they would either renew her or find someone else to replace her quickly for 5 years.
Yeah. Andrew.
Well, nobody would say that Brenda Lucki was a particularly successful RCMP commissioner. She seemed much more interested in managing up and sucking up to her superiors rather than addressing some of the deep-seated problems in the force. But these long predate her. They're much more systemic. We've been reading about RCMP scandals and RCMP screw-ups for years, if not decades. If you're talking about the Mahara affair or the botched investigation into the income trusts, or the toxic culture in the force that has been found by numerous inquiries. So these things are deep-seated. They go back, as I say, many years. They're talking about things that they stem in some parts from the kind of military culture of the force's founding. It stems in part from the vast overreach of the mission it's been given, where it has to be everything from an elite federal investigative force to, patrolling small towns across various provinces, and not doing any of those jobs particularly well. It's stretched far too thin. So yes, let's get a better commissioner, but there are structural reforms that are needed for the force. Whether or not, as Chantal says, this government is particularly competent to enact them can be debated, but I don't think politicians of either of the governing parties that we've had can escape their responsibility for the state of the force. These kinds of reforms have been called for by experts going back many years, and nothing ever seems to change at the force. And even the best commissioner can only do so much with the structure of the force as it is now.
Chantal?
And if all this sounds familiar, it's because we probably said the very same things about the armed forces. We sound like an echo of ourselves here. And as Andrew points out, governments have had recommendations to make changes in both cases, and have sat on them, not just the Liberals, for as long as we've been covering this.
So it's not. So we all seem to agree, or you all seem to agree, that changing the commissioner is not going to change or solve the problems of the RCMP. Althia, is there political will to do the things that we're talking about, make some sort of structural change that would give the commissioner real power, I think, across the country, and make it clear to her who she reports to and how she has to do her job?
Well, I'm not sure that a new commissioner won't make a big difference, because I think the problem with this commissioner, frankly, is that she didn't have the trust of her members. She didn't have the respect of her members. Like, those two things go a long way. And yes, there were, systemic problems, systemic racism, sexism, allegations of mistreatment against people with different sexual orientations. We had, and there's a number of class action lawsuits, even reporters suing the RCMP about treatment in Wet'suwet'en. So there are a lot of problems. Even the provinces, who are openly suggesting that they want to create their own provincial police forces, those that don't, and not work within the RCMP confines. So there are a lot of challenges. But if you have a leader, and I know police officers often want to have one of their own, but I don't know if that's really what is needed. But you need a leader that inspires and that has trust. And then you can start to make the changes. And, Brenda Lucki did try. She has, a Vision 150, because the forces are celebrating their 150 this year, to try to move the needle on systemic racism and other problems in the force, the culture problems in the force. But in order to do that, you have to have a leader that people are willing to follow. And that has been, I think, her biggest problem.
Andrew?
Well, I just have to repeat the point that yes, leaders can drive culture to an extent, and they can help to institute reforms that are capable within the system. They cannot make the kind of sweeping structural changes. They're not statutorily powered to do that. Yeah. Only the government can. And we should mention also the lack of a really effective civilian oversight body as well, as part of the ills that afflict the force. I'm all in favor of having a strong RCMP commissioner, but I think there's only so much that he or she can actually accomplish.
Hey, welcome back to another round of At Issue. The Liberals are once again under fire for ethics violations.
I make it a habit of consulting with the ethics commissioner on a regular basis. I regret that we didn't do that in this case. It's deeply embarrassing.
Parliamentary Secretary Greg Fergus is the latest Liberal caught violating ethics rules. Fergus is under fire for writing a letter to the CRTC advocating for a Black Francophone television channel. This is just the latest in a series of ethics violations for the Liberals, which has prompted the outgoing Commissioner Mario Dion to say the government needs to take ethics more seriously. So what's to be made of the Liberals' repeating issue with ethics? Do the rules need an overhaul? Do the Liberals need a better lesson in how they work? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Althia, and Andrew. So obviously what Greg Fergus did wrong, according to the ethics commissioner here, was that he is a parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, and you can't write that kind of letter. Just to be clear, you can do it if you're a regular old MP, but not in that instance. So what's going on here, Chantal? For Mario Dion, even though he's leaving the job, to say, what the heck is going on? Like, you don't seem to understand these rules. To me, seems significant that he would feel the need to say that.
Okay, two things. In the big picture, I heard the question, do the Liberals have a problem following ethical rules? And suddenly, I don't know why, I saw the Senate under Stephen Harper. And I thought maybe not just the Liberals. Wasn't that how the last Conservative reign ended in a mix of ethical breaches and stretches and abuses to spending practices? But that being said, I do believe that Justin Trudeau has had problems preaching to his own members to follow rules on the basis of the fact that he has accumulated a series of blames from the Ethics Commissioner. It's really hard to say to a minister, you should resign for having breached ethical rules, considering that you have those in your track record as Prime Minister. I also think that the advice of forcing parliamentary secretaries and ministers and their staff to brush up on the rules is probably good advice. Because yes, there are rules that apply to MPs, but that are more lax than if you're a parliamentary secretary than if you're a minister. But bottom line, I think every government after a number of years in office gets a bit too comfortable with ethics rules, and that's been the experience over the past 3 decades.
Sure, but what a lot of people who see the instances of late say to me, Andrew, is what happened? Why are people losing their jobs like in the good old days? Is what they would say to me. And I take Chantal's point that it's hard to do when you're the boss and you've had your own issues. But why is there no? I'm sorry, you can't do this job anymore, given you can't follow these basic rules.
Well, just to reiterate a point that we were making in the previous segment, the culture is set from the top. You know, whether it's that Liberal cabinet ministers and parliamentary secretaries aren't aware of the rules, which is hard to believe, or that they just don't care about them, or as I suspect, and Chantal's right that both parties have had their ethical challenges over the years, but the particular contribution, I think, of this group of Liberals is an abiding sense of their own superior virtue. That may feel they can excuse themselves from the common everyday ethical concerns that would afflict mere mortals. And that would certainly be coming from the top. And yes, compound that the Prime Minister himself has been found guilty of 2 serious ethical offenses, probably should have been found guilty of a 3rd, absolutely makes it difficult for him to lay down the law to members of caucus or members of cabinet, but equally they have failed to do so to him. You know, we don't have a system in Canada that we should have where members of a caucus hold their leader to account when they misbehave like this. So neither the leader holding them to account nor them holding him to account. We certainly don't have a system of any kind of rigorous penalties in the law. It's a $500 fine at worst. So if what we're supposed to fall back on is just people's sense of shame, I'm afraid that ship sailed long ago.
Well, it does seem to be. That is supposed to be what motivates you to behave under these rules, Althia. And I guess to Andrew's point, perhaps it's not enough.
Well, also of getting fired. Like, cabinet ministers should fear that if they do something wrong, that they will get fired, or if they're a member of parliament and they breach the code, that maybe the party will not, sign their papers again. But one thing that's really different with this PMO, I would say, is that they haven't instilled like the fear of God in their MPs and parliamentary secretaries and ministers and staffers, especially staffers, about you cannot let your minister, step outside of the line. And if you really feared that you were going to make like the front page of the newspaper because you didn't do your due diligence, people would pay attention very closely. Like now, I want to be clear that all these offenses are not the same. Like I feel like Greg Fergus, if he was an MP, it's fine to write a letter on behalf of groups to the CRTC, but because he's a prosec, it's different. Like to me, that's very different than Mary Ng, the small business minister, calling up her best friend and giving her a contract to help with communications work. Like that to me is very different.
Sure, totally agree with that.
But you would not do that, like Mary Ng would not do that if she feared that she was going to get a lashing from her caucus mates or the Prime Minister. And that's the internal culture that we do not have with this government.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't seem to have happened in her case, unless it's happened and nobody's told me about it, but there doesn't seem to have been any real consequence for Mary Ng. Chantal.
And you would think it's a no-brainer. The notion of conflict of interest and extending contracts to your friends. I mean, do you need really a course to know about these things? And like Andrew, I think there is an attitude problem here of, well, we can do no wrong because we never mean to do wrong. And that doesn't really work within the confines of what ethics rules are supposed to be.
Well, it also doesn't work because it's not what you mean to do. It's what it looks like you're doing. Isn't that the problem with ethics, Andrew?
Well, in Mary Ng's case, she was availing herself of the George Costanza defense of saying, oh, was that wrong? You know, why didn't my staff flag this to me? I find that unpersuasive in her case. I find it equally unpersuasive in Greg Fergus's case. He was a member of the ethics committee, for God's sakes, and you wouldn't know you're not supposed to phone or write letters to project tribunals or judges. I mean, that's rule number one, frankly.
Yeah.
So I don't find the pleadings of ignorance particularly persuasive, or the sort of attempt to self-justify retroactively. I noted Mary Ng saying in Parliament that she hadn't held herself to the standards that she herself aspires to, or something to that effect, which basically made her sound like she was the good guy and somebody else, you know, named Mary Ng committed all these committed this offense. So yeah, it's a cultural problem that seems to be pretty deeply rooted.
Chantal,
no, but it's also the I can look at myself in the mirror and see no wrong. I'll give you an example. If Brian Mulroney in his first term had applied the rules the way the Liberals have not applied them, he wouldn't have lost so many ministers.
Yeah.
His ministers resigned for all those reasons, for being on a military base in East Germany, in West Germany, where there were prostitutes, for not smelling a can of tuna properly. And here so if you look at that, what you see is actually a decrease or an increase in the tolerance for ethical breaches over the decades.
That's right.
And I'm sure Brian Mulroney never expected me to say something like that about his government, and I certainly never expected to have to say that.
I also didn't expect Andrew to
when-
quote George Costanza, but I gotta leave it there. Now I'll throw things back to Ian in Toronto.